Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Dr. Edward Brodkin is a prominent psychiatrist and neuroscientist known for his work in the fields of autism and social neuroscience. He serves as a tenured Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Adult Autism Spectrum Program and co-directs the Autism Spectrum Program of Excellence. Dr. Brodkin's laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania is focused on genetics and neuroscience studies of autism, as well as clinical trials of treatments to support social functioning and well-being in autistic adults. Dr. Brodkin is also co-author of the book Missing Each Other: How to Cultivate Meaningful Corrections, which explores the science of social connection with a focus on phenomenon known as interpersonal attunement. Dr. Brodkin, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And to kind of jump right into it, could you share what initially drew you to the field of social neuroscience and autism research?
Yeah. During medical school, I became really fascinated by the workings of the brain and neuroscience and brain and behavior. And I'd had a long-standing interest in social neuroscience and some of the early work that was done on social attachment and so on. And this just grew as I went through medical school and into my residency. And I had a chance to start to work with autistic adults and became more and more interested in the neuroscience of autism and social interaction.
And in your book, Missing Each Other, which, by the way, it's a really great book. I love reading it. You explore the science of social connection. What inspired you to write this book?
It actually came out of our work on autism. So Ashley Palathura, who's the co-author, and I were working on developing a program for autistic adults to help them with social functioning. And as we were developing this program, I remember saying to Ashley, I think what we're really trying to teach in this program is attunement or interpersonal attunement, which basically means the ability to be aware of yourself and your own state of mind and body while also connecting with another person and picking up on their cues and staying connected with them during the twists and turns of a conversation or some kind of other interaction. And, as we were working on this for autistic adults, we thought, this isn't just something that people on the autism spectrum could benefit from working on. This is really something that any of us could benefit from working on. It's a really complicated set of skills, and even just getting a little bit better at this can really benefit any of us in our lives. So the book isn't really on autism per se, it's more on the process of connection and attunement in general for any of us.
Yeah, thank you. And that concept of interpersonal attunement, within the book, you also delve deeper into that and into the components of attunement. So could you explain what those are as well?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just say a little bit more about what I mean by attunement, because I think sometimes an example or two can help people visualize what I'm talking about. So if you think of a really good conversation you've had where you felt you were really developing a good rapport with the other person, you really felt connected, you felt like a mutual understanding, that would be an example of attunement. But there are other kinds of examples, like, for example, people playing music together, like in a group. If you're playing an instrument and someone else is playing an instrument and you're playing really well together, you have to be really aware of what you're doing and what you're playing, as well as what the other person is doing and playing, and the way the two of you are fitting together and sort of flowing together in the course of that music. Or it could be the way dancers dance together. That would be another example. Or the way team athletes move together, down the court, or the field. So there's many kinds of examples of interpersonal attunement, and it's a really complicated, mysterious almost phenomenon. When you see, let's say, two great athletes working together in this way, you might think, like, how do they do it? Where do they get that skill from? And so in the book, we tried to kind of break it down into its component parts. Like, what is this process of attunement composed of? And can we work on each of these components to get better at it? So we broke attunement down into 4 parts that we call relaxed awareness, listening, understanding, and mutual responsiveness. And then we have a chapter on each of those components in the book. And at the end of the chapter, we suggest some exercises to help develop each of them. So I could go more into what I mean by each of those, but maybe I'll pause there because that was a lot.
One question I had real quick is, and I know there's like a lot of debate over this, but like, what kind of, I guess, language do you prefer? Do you use neurodiverse or neurominority? Like, because it really changes often from person to person. So I just was curious.
I'm comfortable using whatever language others are comfortable with, and I know there's some variability about that, like identity first language and person first language, and um, I'm comfortable saying like neurodivergent individuals or neurodiversity. I often think in terms of a neurodiversity framework, when it comes to the autism spectrum and working with research participants and patients.
So, how do you apply the concepts from your book to improve social connections in neurodiverse populations?
Yeah, so we're actually very actively working on that right now. Here in my lab at University of Pennsylvania, we've developed this program that I alluded to before that we call TuneIn. It's an acronym, TuneIn, that stands for Training to Understand and Navigate Emotions and Interactions. And really, this program makes use of that concept of attunement and practices to develop it. So TuneIn, the way it's currently formulated, is taught sort of like a course, like a semester-long course. Although it's not lectures, it's sort of discussion groups and exercises. And we break it down into each of those components that I was talking about before: relaxed awareness, listening, understanding, mutual responsiveness. So there are sessions on each of them. And then ultimately, we want to try to put all of these together in this process of connecting. So for one example, let's say relaxed awareness. We work on the idea of being aware, like aware of what's going on inside of ourselves and aware of what's going on around us and the other person, while staying relatively calm and relaxed, which is actually kind of challenging to do because, sometimes when you're aware of things, they can be stressful or they can feel overwhelming in some way or other. So it's developing this ability to be aware of what's going on while also regulating ourselves and regulating our emotions. And that doesn't mean being unemotional by any means. It doesn't mean being super calm and zen all the time and unflappable. Like when we're aware of ourselves, we're going to feel our own emotions. But we develop ways of being aware of that and listening to that while not being completely overwhelmed by it. And so, I mean, some of the exercises we do are might be familiar to members of your audience, like mindfulness-based kinds of exercises and so on, to develop that skill.
And could you also discuss the primary challenges in developing interventions to enhance social functioning in individuals with autism?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's a number of challenges. Going back to the idea of neurodiversity, let's say, some of the traditional social skills programs have tended to teach what you might call neurotypical social skills, like how do neurotypical individuals interact, and how can we develop a curriculum for teaching neurodivergent individuals to act more neurotypical. That framework has really been called into question quite heavily. The idea of trying to make autistic or neurodivergent individuals look more neurotypical. And there can be issues with masking and camouflaging, and those can be sources of stress and real distress among people on the spectrum. So that poses a challenge. Like, how can we be supportive to people on the spectrum without trying to encourage masking and camouflaging? And I think the way that we're looking at that is in TuneIn, we're trying to offer a set of skills and tools that are quite generic, really, for anyone. Like I mentioned before, they're not an attempt to cure autism, so to speak. These are skills that I think any of us, whether we're neurotypical or neurodivergent, could benefit from. And so basically developing these really fundamental skills of like skills of self-regulation and so on, and listening skills, but not being really specific about like the exact way you should implement in your life is to do XYZ to look more neurotypical. That's not what we're doing. So I think that's one of the challenges. Another challenge is that social interaction, social functioning is so complicated. It's so diverse. It's so context dependent. So, to really address the needs of adults in their lives, we have to give them skills that they can choose to apply or not apply flexibly in different contexts as they see fit. And I would say another challenge is that, when you're a child, there's more tolerance and patience, I think, for, I don't know, when things don't go so well, or someone has a meltdown or something like that. In adult life, unfortunately, there's not enough societal understanding of the autism spectrum, and adults are held to a really high standard in the society, and so that can be challenging for adults, I would say. So there's a lot of challenges. Also, there's no, there are medicines that help with certain things like depression and anxiety and so on, but there's no medicine we have that addresses these social issues. It's really a learning process. And so it's the challenge of creating a curriculum and a learning environment that is helpful to adults.
That's a great segue into my next question. So, regarding that last point, how do you tailor interventions for adults with autism, given the diverse spectrum of needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a huge amount of diversity of people on the spectrum. We can't generalize about everyone who's autistic is a certain way. And so, there is a need for tailoring our interventions to the needs of the individual. The way that we have been approaching that so far in TuneIn is we have a basic framework of certain kinds of, understanding and tools that we want to offer our participants. But we work with small groups, so it's not a group of like 50 people where we have to meet the needs of everyone. It's more like a group of 4 to 6 people, and we can get to know each of the individuals in the group quite well and have a sense of where they, what their specific needs are, what their specific goals are, where they're having difficulties. And then we can tailor what we're doing to some extent to the needs of each individual. And like, for example, we have role plays and conversation practice, and we encourage each individual in the group to think about like, what are some situations that they're facing in their lives that they want to work on, and we can role play around that. Those are some of the examples of the ways we try to tailor this to individual needs.
And your research also explores the neural circuits involved in social behavior. So, could you elaborate on the specific neural pathways that you see as being related to autism and social functioning?
Sure. There are a lot of neural circuits and parts of the brain that are involved in social functioning because social functioning is such a complex, cognitively demanding, emotionally demanding process. So, there's been research on something called the fusiform face area that has to do with facial recognition. There's been work on areas like the superior temporal sulcus and the medial prefrontal cortex. I can throw out names. I mean, some of our research, my earlier research, was focused a little bit more on the amygdala, which is involved in emotion and emotion processing and so on. So there's many, many areas in the brain. Currently, I'm involved in a collaborative project with Timothy Roberts, a professor at Penn and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, to try to better understand ways in which adults on the autism spectrum process sensory information. And so, we're working on that. But it's certainly a really, really rich and complicated topic and something we have a lot left to learn about.
And how do you think genetic factors interact with environmental influences to shape social behavior?
Yeah, I think both have an influence. I think that I don't know if you're asking more generally for all of us or on the topic of autism, but in terms of all of us, our genetics to some extent influences our temperament. To some degree, there's an inborn temperament. There are probably genetic influences on extroversion, introversion, emotionality, ability to emotionally regulate, and so on. And then there's lots of environmental influences as well, and those could be there could be hundreds or thousands of environmental influences on any of us, from uh, hormonal influences, dietary influences, early experiences growing up, and so on. I think when it comes to autism, autism is considered to be fairly heritable. In other words, there's a strong genetic influence on being on the autism spectrum. It's not 100% genetic. There seem to be environmental influences as well. So it's an area of really, really active research trying to tease out these things. And there's certainly not one autism gene that we're going to discover someday. What it seems more like is that there are hundreds of genes that each contribute some to predisposition to be on the autism spectrum, and there are probably hundreds of environmental factors. So it's a really complicated thing. And I'll just add that at the University of Pennsylvania, we have something called the Autism Spectrum Program of Excellence, or ASPE. And this is a really large genetic study where we're trying to tease out more of the genetic and environmental influences on autism and social behavior.
About the thing you were mentioning earlier with like how difficult it is to kind of figure out the environmental factors that are affecting it because there are just so many of them. When doing research looking at environmental factors, I'd imagine it would be hard to kind of separate if a person is different because like of their different experience at a young age or of something that happened later in life. So is there kind of a way to circumvent that barrier?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a variety of methodologies. I suppose at a simplistic level, if you're studying young children, then whatever environmental influences were contributing must have happened early in life because you're studying them young. I think when you're studying older individuals, it can be harder to tease out and it's more complicated, and perhaps those early factors interacted in some way with later factors in people's lives. Like, for example, I mean, a lot of autistic individuals at some point in their life have experienced bullying or, being excluded or, mistreated in some way in school or elsewhere. And those experiences can be traumatic and anxiety provoking and can further contribute to, alterations in social functioning or depression or anxiety. And so, yeah, we have to think about all of these kinds of environmental influences. I mean, one thing I will clarify too is that I'm not, the notion that autism is caused by poor parenting or cold parents has been discarded. We don't, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about environmental influences, but there are so many other things in our environment that we're exposed to that might contribute in one way or another.
What role does neuroplasticity play in social behavior? And how might it be leveraged to develop new therapeutic approaches for autism?
Mhm. Um, well, neuroplasticity is this idea that the brain is not set in stone and our behavior is not set in stone, that um, the brain literally can change with learning through these biological processes of neuroplasticity. And so I think, as we're growing up and experiencing interactions in school and with others, our brain is to some extent shaped by those experiences. Um, but, we remain plastic and able to learn, not literally plastic, but that process of neuroplasticity remains, and we continue to be able to learn from early childhood into adolescence into adulthood. And so that's why, we're working on programs like TuneIn that I said earlier are learning processes. And I think that we can work with people's inherent capacity to learn and develop new skills to help them with social functioning.
And what are the potential implications of your research on the understanding of social cognition deficits beyond autism, such as in other psychiatric or neurodevelopmental disorders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you refer to social cognition, I think you're referring to this idea of how do we understand social interactions? How do we understand other people? How do we pick up on other people's social cues? Like a lot of what we communicate with each other is nonverbal. Some of what we communicate with each other is in the literal meaning of the words we're saying. Like if you took what I'm saying and just turned it into text that you could read. I mean, some of what we're communicating is that, but a lot of what we communicate is through our tone of voice, through our body language, through our facial expression. And so the ability to pick up on those cues and then to try to understand the other person's perspective as well as your own, which sometimes is different, right? Like your perspective right now is somewhat different from my perspective right now. And I can sort of imagine your perspective, perhaps, although I don't fully have access to it, but I can develop a kind of hypothesis or model of what I think your perspective is. And I know more or less what my perspective is, and an ability to hold those two perspectives in mind and not think, mine is the right one, yours is the wrong one, or vice versa, but that they're different and we're interacting with each other. So those kinds of things are what we're talking about with social cognition. I think that to your question, I think social cognition is affected in many different psychiatric and neurodevelopmental conditions, not just autism. And so, if someone is really, really depressed or anxious, or someone has schizophrenia or some other neurodevelopmental condition, any of these really can have influences on social cognition, and in turn can then affect our day-to-day functioning. Because if we have trouble picking up on other people's cues or having a decent understanding of other people's perspectives, it can really make getting through our day-to-day lives more difficult and more stressful. So I think by better understanding social cognition and the processes of them and how to help people build up their social cognition, I think that could be helpful in many conditions.
And could you also explain how your work has contributed to understanding the heterogeneity in social behavior among individuals with autism?
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of diversity or heterogeneity among people on the autism spectrum. And in some of our work, we've tried to break down this idea of social functioning broadly into some different components. Like there's the one component is motivation or apparent motivation to interact with others. Another is anxiety level. You know, many of us have a little bit of anxiety when we're meeting new people, but for people on the spectrum, social interactions can be even more anxiety provoking and overwhelming. Then there's social cognition, which we were just talking about. And then there's the skill of engaging in conversation and the back and forth and give and take and turn taking. So in terms of your question about heterogeneity, different people on the autism spectrum may have more challenges in some of those areas and not so much in others. Like, for example, some people on the spectrum may have a lot of social anxiety, but less difficulty in some of those other areas. Or other individuals may not be so socially anxious, but may have a lot of difficulty taking other people's perspectives. So I think our research has contributed, and many other investigators around the world, to trying to better understand, what are the differences among people on the spectrum in terms of where they're having the most challenges, and then how can we use that information to best target our supports and treatments to individualize them.
And in what ways do your findings challenge or confirm existing theories of social behavior in autism, such as the theory of the mind or the social motivation theory?
Yeah, I was actually a co-author on a paper on the social motivation theory of autism. I think it generated a lot of controversy. It was a number of years ago, and really a lot of pushback with the idea that I don't think this is what we were really saying in the paper, but I think some people took it to mean that, people on the autism spectrum are not motivated to interact with others. So I think that idea that, the essence of autism is a low motivation to interact with others is oversimplified and basically not true. I mean, most people on the autism spectrum are motivated to interact with others. They do want friends, they do want relationships, and so on. I think, so I think we're getting a more nuanced view of that. There are some people, going back to heterogeneity, there's some people on the spectrum who do present as more withdrawn. And I think we need to kind of better understand to what extent are there motivational elements in that, or is it really more anxiety elements or communication difficulties and so on. But, I would just go back to that idea that there are many, many components, motivation, anxiety, cognition, et cetera, to social functioning. Then you mentioned, I think, the theory of mind. So theory of mind goes back to what we were talking about social cognition. So essentially, you can think of theory of mind as perspective taking. So like when I'm talking to you now, I realize you're a real person. You have your own mind. You have your own perspective. You're not like a robot or something like that. And so theory of mind means essentially my ability to imagine what your perspective probably is, how you're viewing this situation. And, I think that's, again, that can be affected in autism. I think we're getting a more nuanced view of it. I think it's hazardous to try to claim that we can understand all of autism by one dimension. Like if we try to say that the essence of autism is a problem with theory of mind, and that's what it's all about, and if we can work on that, then we're good. I think that's very, very oversimplified. I don't think any one thing like that, whether it's social motivation or theory of mind, is the be all and end all of understanding autism. I think, autism is a multifaceted, complex spectrum. And I think it's worth studying each of these things, but I think essentially what I would say is let's not oversimplify it and say it's all just whatever. It's all just social motivation. It's all just theory of mind. I think each of these things may make some contribution and is worth understanding.
And how do you integrate advancements in technology such as neuroimaging or genetic sequencing into your research?
Well, a couple of the projects that I mentioned earlier in our chat involve those technologies. So, for example, the ASPE study, the Autism Spectrum Program of Excellence. And if listeners are interested in what this study is, they can just Google UPenn ASPE and they'll find it. They'll find a website describing more about the research. But in that study, we're using genome sequencing. So we're looking at with people's consent and keeping this information very private and protected. But we're studying genome sequence and trying to better understand the relationship between people's genomes and aspects of the autism traits. And then when it comes to brain imaging, I mentioned earlier my study with Dr. Roberts at Children's Hospital. And in that study, we're using a number of kind of brain imaging and electrophysiology methods, so including MRI of the brain, sort of structural pictures of the brain, as well as something called MEG or magnetoencephalography, which is able to study the electrical activity in the brain in a very localized manner. Like so we know exactly what part of the brain is being active and at really over short time scales. So it's not just like averaging over 20 minutes, but the fluctuations in activity in the brain we can study with that method. And that's the method that we're using to better understand the way sensory processing happens in the brain in autism, which is another really, really important issue, because I'm sure you know that many people on the autism spectrum complain of sensory hypersensitivities that are really distressing to them, or sometimes reduced sensory sensitivities.
And many interventions often focus on early childhood, but your work involves adults. Why is it important to develop interventions for adults?
Yes, that's right. I do focus on adults. I think that a lot of autism research has really focused on childhood and early intervention, with the idea that, if we can intervene early, that's maybe the best time to help, and we could really alter developmental trajectories and so on. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, but the adult population has been relatively neglected. Neglected is a strong word, but has not been studied as much. Not as many resources have been developed for adults. And if you look at the way the educational system works, usually after the age of 21, many parents call it like falling off the cliff, like all the supports and so on that had been there for their children and their teens sort of fall off around age 21, and there's very little available for them. But people go on and live full lives after age 21, and they continue to need supports. And there's a lot of issues with where social functioning comes into play as adults, whether it's continuing with education, making friends, making romantic relationships, employment, getting along with people in the workplace, and so on. So there's a lot of areas of needs for adults that really have not been adequately addressed. So that's why I've chosen to focus on adults.
And what considerations do you take into account when developing interventions for adults?
Well, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, like heterogeneity, so that the needs of one adult may not be the same as the needs of another adult. So really trying to best understand individuals' needs and tailor interventions to those specific individuals' needs. I think as we work on developing understanding and skills and so on, the idea of applying those in the adults' lives in the areas that are important to them. Um, and I would emphasize that idea of important to them. Like we try to find out from each of the adults we're working with, like, what are your priorities? What are your goals? So rather than necessarily imposing upon them what we think they should be doing, really taking seriously what's important to them, what do they hope for, what are their goals. Um, and then as we teach, let's say in this TuneIn program, some skill or some greater understanding, like how can we put that into practice in your daily life in a way that's meaningful to you? Um, Perhaps it's in the way they are able to have conversations with their family members or develop friendships or, apply this in a workplace setting or a community setting. So, I mean, those are some of the things that we think about when we're working with adults.
Looking forward, how do you envision the integration of neuroscience, genetics, and psychology in advancing our understanding and interventions for social challenges in autism?
Yeah, I think that we're in a exciting time in terms of research, and we're learning a lot at a fast pace about genetics and neuroscience and so on. Um, I think that a challenge has been to take basic science findings, like from genetics and neuroscience, and then translate that into things that will actually help people and help families. And so I think we're going to need greater emphasis on what's sometimes called translational research or clinical research. So taking our rapidly advancing basic science knowledge and then using that to develop better supports for people on the spectrum. And then I think more and more at a biological level, we're going to come to understand that, again, there's lots of heterogeneity among people on the spectrum, and that probably our interventions are not going to be one size fits all. Like, this one intervention done exactly this way is going to be good for everyone. But we're more and more going to move towards what's sometimes called personalized medicine or personalized psychology. So, in other words, getting a real understanding of this individual, their individual biology, their individual psychology, and then using that to personalize interventions or supports for them.
And what advice would you give to young researchers and clinicians entering the field of autism and neuroscience?
My main advice would be it's a great field, and please join us. There's a lot that we need bright young people coming into this field. We need more research in this area. We actually need more clinicians as well in this area, especially when it comes to adults, my area of interest. There's really a shortage of clinicians, including psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, and so on, who have an interest in understanding and a comfort level in working with people on the autism spectrum. So we need more clinicians like that. We need more translational researchers, as I was mentioning before. So researchers who have some understanding of basic science and who are interested in then taking that basic science and sort of translating it into improved interventions for people on the spectrum and testing the effectiveness of those. So I think basically I would really encourage young people who have an interest in this area, because I think it's a fascinating area. I find it endlessly fascinating, social neuroscience, autism, all of this. It will keep you interested for the rest of your life, I think, if you go into it. And it will be a very meaningful career because you'll be addressing a real area of need that can help people.
Dr. Brodkin, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks for taking the time to participate in this interview. Your insights into the neural and genetic basis of social behavior, as well as your work on autism and neuroscience, are very enlightening. I really appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise, and your passion and commitment to improving the lives of individuals on the spectrum is truly inspiring. Thank you once again for the very engaging and informational conversation. and it was a privilege to learn from you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I really appreciated being on, and I think your channel is terrific. So thanks again.